Hello and welcome to Burgundy Unpicked, our latest podcast at Corny & Barrow, delving into the Burgundy en Primeur season. And today's episode is quite a joyous one, where we are talking about certainly many would regard as our most thrilling agency, but certainly one of them. And it's Domaine de la Romanée-Conti in the 2022 vintage, taking a little sidestep from the 23s. As most people know, they release the wines when they are bottled and ready to come into the market. And today, joined with me, we've got Guy Senton.
Hello.
Aaron Eccles.
Hello.
And Mr. William Hargrove.
Good morning, Joseph.
Pleasure to have you on board.
Well, about right, about time.
So let's jump in. I mean, Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, and for the purposes of the podcast, we are going to shorten it to DRC, but, normally we like to give it its full honour and name and title, but we have released, we are live as this goes out with our DRC 2022 offer. We had Perrine Fenal and Bertrand de Vilaine over last week from the Domaine, the co-directors, the magical team behind the wines, along with some exceptional people in the cave and the vineyards, to present the 2022s as we normally do every year. And we had our tasting with press journalists that came along and some sommeliers and trade partners. And a masterclass, which went very, very well by all accounts. And I think we should probably start with the 22s. Not going to delve into the vintage report because most people have a good grasp of that already. But I think where we'll start is with the wines themselves. Guy, you and I were very fortunate to be part of the team in November that went to taste the 2022s, which subsequently led to the notes that have been scribbled down by Adam and yourself and me. Do you want to start there in your impressions of the wines and kick us off?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I mean, what an honour it is to go and taste at the Domaine. We were there in November, as you say. I think the format of the tasting when we go is very special in the sense that this year we were around a table. We're sometimes down in the cellar, but this time we were around a table in an office, essentially. But it felt like a fairly ecclesiastical, fairly sort of reverential setting. And we tasted in absolute silence. There were a handful of us, probably 8 of us, I think, around the table. And we tasted through the wines. You've got enough time to go through all of them twice. And make notes. Everyone was scribbling away in their notebooks. And we got to the end of this astonishing flight of wines. And I can't remember who made the first comment, but somebody said, right, first impressions. And it's almost as if nobody wanted to begin, because how do you start to put into words these incredible wines, which each tasting note of mine was probably a side of my notebook, so there's so much going on in each of them. And it's almost overwhelming knowing where to start. I think one route in is to say that sometimes the wines of the Domaine approach the ethereal, and this sort of word that we look for in the very best examples of Pinot Noir. And I think if wines can seem to take off into the air and become ethereal, then I think that's a sign of real extreme quality. What I will say about the 22s is they do have that capacity in places, but I also loved that there's a terrestrial side to them as well. They seem to have their feet anchored in the ground. And so to be able to do both things, in some cases side by side, I think is very, very special indeed. They have this flamboyance, but they also have a very seated, very anchored quality to them.
Yeah, I think I remember the tasting as well. I can't help. I mean, I haven't been involved in it many a times, but lucky to have had quite a few. And as I was scribbling my notes, looking around the table, and you just sort of see these moments of people's eyes just sort of awakening with sort of interpretation of what they're tasting, and this spark of joy that just comes in, and that includes on Perrine's and Bertrand's face as well. I think it's also probably quite good to start with 22. It's bedfellows in terms of quality and vintages that have preceded are going to be the likes of 20, 18, 15, 10, 5, 99. This vintage is going to be talked about with the very best vintages of the recent 20, 30 years. So expectations were probably quite high, I think it's fair to say, from us all, to see what they were going to sort of deliver. And I mean, crikey, I think they are quite exceptional. And as you said, they straddle, okay, a little bit more leaning towards the ethereal, but there's certainly this beautiful mineral presence within the wines. And that's what you want with these terroir-driven styles. So I guess, coming over to Aaron and Will, You tasted them for the first time last week, obviously when we had the masterclass with the press. And before we each go into,
Well, I mean, I tasted them out of Domaine three weeks ago. So, it is a fascinating vintage. I think the thing that it's easy to get slightly worried about, worried in inverted commas, is whether the vintage is going to leave too much of a stamp on the wines at a young stage. There's absolutely no doubt that with age, the individual terroirs, individual crus come through. But you can get vintages where at a young age there is a little bit of a stamp of the vintage. And I think that maybe happened in vintages like 18, where there's a sort of stylistic thing that's going to mean the wines are going to take a little bit longer to show their personalities. I thought what was staggering with the 22s was that they really showed marked differences even at this early stage. And in my case, not that long after they'd been bottled, which obviously can be a time when the wines are, when any wine is in a little bit of a sulk in a way. So that was fascinating. I thought there were some real overperformers, and we'll get on to the individual wines obviously in a minute. But yeah. I thought there were some real overperformers, and I think the vintage is a lovely one, and a vintage that was probably relatively straightforward to make, which is won't mean there was any lack of work to be done, but things when there weren't too many hurdles to overcome, as guys touched on in various other podcasts.
Yeah, and Aaron, so this is your second vintage since joining Cornies for DRC. I mean, it is quite an exceptional time, isn't it? And it's a big pull for people who work here, but obviously the customers as well. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's why you get into wine, isn't it? To taste the Holy Grail. I'd obviously heard that you had a bit of sort of a clandestine moment at the Domaine when you were tasting and brought out the emotional side of tasting these wines.
I needed a hanky at one point.
So I tasted the wines Wednesday morning before the masterclass. And usually for me at that point, it's a case of just trying to make sure that all of the wines are A, in good shape, and B, because I opened a couple of each, just making sure that both bottles are the same. What became apparent through tasting them is they are sort of some of the most showy and enjoyable wines at this stage in their evolution. Sort of all the components were there. You just get the sense going through, which I'm quite lucky to do, going through all the Grand Cru reds first and then the whites, that there is this effortless seam that runs through all of the wines, but also you can see that the vintage, the nature of the fruit and the quality of it is pretty stunning.
Yeah, indeed, and it is. It's a good point to know that 22 is quite a sizable crop for them as well, and they've not only achieved exceptional quality, but there's a decent abundance. You don't get a vintage that comes along that often.
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to go into detail in about the season, but I mean, the one thing to remember about 22 is that it came after that tiny frost vintage of 21, and so there is a natural tendency in the vines to kind of push and to become more productive than they would otherwise. So yeah, 22 is a big crop, and I think to be able to produce this high quality with a big crop and manage that accordingly is very impressive. The one thing I was going to mention additionally is that this is not a classic setup of wines in the sense that there's a progression from a humble wine up to a great wine. I mean, these are all great wines, so we're not really talking about a gradation of qualities here. But I think the likes of Corton, which is now into its first flush of real maturity, I suppose you would say, after the first vintage in 2009, and Echezeaux itself, they were real overperformers in 22, I would say.
Agreed.
And I think to have that sort of extreme quality from those two wines was very gratifying.
Yeah, I think especially Echezeaux, it seemed to have this bolder personality than it's ever had. We have felt it being building in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, whether we attribute that to vine age, a stylistic change, but it has become a little bit more gregarious, and it had really quite brilliant structure and power underlying the fruit component of Echezeaux and the florality that vineyard can obviously bring. And I thought out of all of them, it was one of my highlights, definitely. And yeah, the Corton, when I was going through my own notes earlier, I was just, control is what I underlined. I felt there was so much control within Corton because it can be so broad-shouldered and it can be so muscular in its style. Corton from lesser producers quite often get criticised for being a little bit too rustic or to have that sort of more savoury animal side. But this has caught on DNA, but it has the sort of the whole bunch of character that DRC brings in real controlled dynamics.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, there were two comments that I scribbled down during the tasting from somebody else, and the two words which struck me were easy and rooted about Corton. It's just very comfortable in its own skin. It's just a very proficient wine, I would say, in 22.
Yeah, I enjoyed it greatly. I completely agree, and I think it's something that Alexandre Bernier and stuff, who's the winemaker, very much behind the scenes. I think it's obviously been something that he's seen the whole of his time. He started in about 08, I think was his first vintage. So I think the Corton is quite something, and it is a part. It is that different style. If any of the wines had a sort of nod to even, dare I say it, like the Northern Rhone or something, in terms of having that little bit more graphite, that little bit more sort of ferrous element. Yeah, I thought that the Corton was strong. I'd love to do. We should organise and do a vertical of the Corton now that we've got a good run of vintages. It would be a really good.
It's a good point on the winemaking. Maybe we'll circle back to it because I think it's had a bit of an impact on a couple of the wines. Yeah, Aaron, taking on from the Echezot into Grand Echezot, and
the thing that we discussed, Echezot was sort of the most open and bright fruited Echezot that I've tasted in a long time. It sort of runs back to that thing of, I think sometimes, as Guido's just said, these are all Grand Cru wines. But I do think that Echezot will be the most delightful thing to drink within the next decade, because it shows you that the DNA of the Domaine. You have fruit that's picked at its absolute pristine best. So I know that Echezot was harvested the latest this year on sort of 11th, 12th, 13th of September. So you have that sort of ripeness, but they harvest late so that the stems are fully ripe for whole bunch fermentation, and then you get that sort of big spice from the whole bunch fermentation, but it never takes over from the fruit. And then finally that sort of 100% new oak that just means that all of this is encased in sort of pure quality all the way around. We were having quite an enjoyable time retasting that Richebourg, so much so that I think that we made far too much noise when we were tasting the Richebourg. So one of our colleagues sort of opened the door and was like, "It sounds like you two are having far too much fun here at 20 past 8 in the morning," which obviously we were. And then they, of course, joined us to taste La Tâche and Romanée-Conti. But the quality running through of that, I think that sort of leads into stylistically. These wines are of a style that many have tried to replicate.
Yeah. I mean, in that sense, they are the kind of leader of this. I know Adam hates us talking about whole bunch fermentation, but this perfumed. Let's call it perfumed and elegant and sort of exotic. You have the fruit character, but you also have something derived from the entirety of the bunch, and I think that's what makes it special, in the sense that you're making a sort of holistic expression of the fruit of the vineyard. And the DRC are the archetypes of that style. I think, you contrast that with the very pure, very sort of fruit-only approach of Henri Jaillet, for example, and you've got those two kind of tendencies. But yeah, fascinating to see.
I mean, that is one of the interesting things, is that, a lot of people in Burgundy, Echezot is their top wine, and I was absolutely blown away by it this year. I mean, I sort of finished my note by sort of saying that a very 22, an exuberant poison power, arguably the most serious Echezot I can remember at this stage. There is an openness about it, but there's no lack of seriousness as well.
Oh, totally.
I've been blessed to taste a few over the years, and I just think it's brilliant. And it's a real mistake to look at it as the first of the Vosne wines. If you like.
That's it.
And moving on into Grand Eche, which I've always had a real soft spot for. I think it's often forgotten wine of the range is probably the wrong way to put it, but it's slightly overlooked at times. And I just think it's a more stealthy wine. It's arguably a more serious wine and a slightly shyer. If Echezot and Grand Echezot were sort of brothers, the Grand Eche would be older, a little bit more introverted, and the Echezot would be the sort of whippersnapper, kicking his brother from behind. But I just thought Grand Eche, I think, is a bit of a sleeper in 22, but I think it's a pretty profound one.
Yeah, I think with on that pairing, it's wonderful if you're having to get a case of both or a bottle of both through the allocation process. They are two brilliant examples to have, because, I mean, by no means are we sort of diminishing Grand Echezot here. I think the point we want to make, I think all of us agree, Echezot is probably, certainly for me, the most sort of the biggest overachiever of this range in 2022, where Grand Echezot this podcast is all about candor. I think it is the better wine. It is a slight step up in quality overall, but like you said, it's going to take time. But there's this unbelievable poise, and what I loved about Grenache was there was far more mineral-rich presence there, which I think is what kind of gives it that sort of shire character now, which will take it to another level of complexity when the fruit emerges, and that whole bunch character, which is a massively important component, as Guy has stated, adds that sort of lift and ethereal nature to it as well. So
we'll get on to the actual sort of drinking of the wines and things a little bit later. But I guess if I had a bottle of each, and sadly I won't, but I would probably have them on separate nights and have fantastic nights twice rather than bother with it being a competition, is I guess what I mean. Yeah. I think they both completely stand on their own. And so like I say, I wouldn't turn it into a competition with them in the same way as Romanée-Conti and Richebourg, which we might come on to, and is always a sort of natural sort of bit of a sort of sibling rivalry.
Yeah. They've almost been jostling for place over the last few vintages, haven't they? Yeah. Or last several vintages. And it's interesting to note the different order of presentation sometimes. Sometimes you get RSV first, sometimes Richebourg first. It's an interesting sort of state in development, I suppose.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I think that sort of stems, really from the fact that Romanée-Saint-Vivant was a big replantation project, obviously during the 90s. I think what's considered one of the most powerful RSVs pre-replanting was 91, and then it started going through its sort of phase. And certainly 2001, it sort of kicks the doors back open and says, I'm here and I've arrived. And that just means in between that period, there's just these different sort of personalities of Romanée-Saint-Vivant on a more sort of fragrant side, lighter side, maybe potentially, again, a more transparent side for minerality. But on this vintage, Romanée-Saint-Vivant, I always associate RSV with that sort of floral, high-lifted, sort of high-toned character and pretty and fragrant, and it has that. But when you taste the palate on the 22, it's a serious boy. And it's, for me, one of the things I underlined in my notes was that when you get to the palate, it really puffs its chest out. And that's not normal for RSV. And I say normal inverted commas, as a sort of a trend in the last 10 years, which gives this feel of expanse, of more sort of innate power underneath, which is lovely to see. Richebourg is one you always associate with that drive and that verve and that sort of
power.
Yeah, power and bigger structure. And it's there, but, there's a density in Richebourg, which potentially isn't Romanée-Saint-Vivant. But you've got two different sort of quite stylistic changes here, which is fascinating to see.
I don't see as much of a change, as much of a difference in intensity this year as I've seen with others, whereas I would often argue that Romanée-Saint-Vivant is the more floral lifted, less intense wine, and Richebourg is, it's got bigger shoulders, it's a forward if Romanée-Saint-Vivant's a back, in rugby terms, sorry. But I think this year, they're equally intense in their personalities. Romanée-Saint-Vivant is more on the lifted red side, and Richebourg is a slightly darker, more brooding, but I think the intensity of those two characters are just as strong as each other this year, which is one of the first times I can remember that.
We've got a bit of split opinion as well amongst the team on their favourites here, because I slightly favour Richebourg in this vintage myself.
You've been wrong before, to be fair.
Adam is obviously, and Will, by the sounds of it, adore Romanée-Saint-Vivant, but the thing with Richebourg is I just think the poise and the structure is so incredibly well balanced. These chalky tannins, fruit coated, the power is there. There's this crash of acidity that comes through. And it just leaves this finesse, this feel of finesse where it's so hard to find in any other wine.
But maybe it's just that Adam and I are a bit older, but I think a bird in hand is worth two in the bush, as they would say. And from that point of view, Romanée-Saint-Vivant is always going to be there. Yeah. I would be far less, again, talking about drinking them, far less nervous of opening a bottle of RSV at any stage, because I think it encapsulates that Pinot sort of, lifted, red-fruited side. Richebourg, I would be more concerned about the sulkiness that you can sometimes get, I guess. Arguably, could it be more profound given more time than RSV? Yeah, quite possibly.
Probably more exotic as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, I agree. I think, I totally agree with what you just said, Will. I think sort of there's a prettiness and a sort of accessibility to RSV that you don't get in Richebourg. There's a surliness, a sultriness, a sort of a slight sort of dangerous glint in the eye in Richebourg. And I think, if you catch it on the right day, it's going to be amazing and it'll deliver the earth. But I think equally it could be quite hunkered down.
Yeah, if there's a gangster amongst the range, it's definitely Richebourg.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to echo that, it's the same thing. I always look for and enjoy Pinot Noir with sort of that minerality and that sort of really nice Pinoté note to it. And that usually means that I love Romanée-Conti, Echezot, La Tâche. Whereas this year, it just felt like just Richebourg came out and punched me in the face, actually. It just took me for an absolute ride because it was just like, I'm here. There's various levels of sort of brooding dark fruit, and then all firing on cylinders with acidity firing through at you. It was sort of sensational to taste it, and hence why we were like, wow, that is a Richebourg for the ages.
Yeah, no, indeed. Well, La Tâche and Romanée-Conti.
Moving on to Monopole. Moving on to the Monopoles.
Yeah, the Monopoles, absolutely. Yeah. Thoughts on these two, Guy? Do you want to start us off?
Okay. I mean, again, sort of where to start. But
yeah.
The La Tâche I found the easier of the two to taste. And I probably say that on both occasions that I tasted it. I just thought it was so complete. My slightly embarrassing tasting note ends up as magical liquid, which it really was. It's just it's got such completeness and such kaleidoscopic kind of complexity to it. The Tâche does have the great power, but it also has this sort of weightless quality, and I think this is what I was trying to get at the beginning with the idea of the ethereal. It's something which almost fills your mouth with volume rather than weight, and I think the really great wines, especially made from Pinot Noir, especially from Burgundy, they do deliver this, and I think La Tâche is a supreme example of that. Romanée-Conti, yeah, I mean, it's such a complete wine, but I had a feeling that it just needed a bit more time to come out of its shell. I find it's not always as forthcoming as La Tâche in my experience when I taste it. I mean, I think there's a filigree sort of uber finesse to the tannins, which I think clearly bodes very well for the future. And there's just beautiful structure. But of the two, a very notch higher. I scored Richebourg slightly higher. Sorry, I scored La Tâche slightly higher.
Yeah, I mean, I have the words absurdly good in both tasting notes, which is obviously very useless and boring. But I adored both. I found La Tâche a little bit darker than it sometimes is. Often it's one of the lighter colours, but as Gianfranco Soldero once said to me, colour is for idiots. So it doesn't really tell you a great deal, but I thought both were incredibly impressive. I actually thought, and this may well, we vary so much when it comes to tasting and opinions, but also I tasted them two months after you guys. But again, from bottle as you did. But the Romanée-Conti was just, staggering when I tasted it. In that, I completely concur with what you're saying. Ordinarily, it's a little bit shyer. It's sort of almost imperfectly perfect in its completeness. It's sort of it's hard to get an edge to it and to therefore get your head around it. I just found it quite exuberant when I tasted. So I thought both were exquisite, but I thought that where La Tâche, exactly as you described, and was probably the case when you tasted it back in November, often slightly shows off a little bit more than Romanée-Conti. I was maybe ever so slightly the other way around in that I was so surprised by. I mean, Romanée-Conti I thought was just showing its real class. A little bit earlier than it sometimes does, but I mean, it's a ridiculous thing to pick holes in.
Yeah, no, I don't want to go over the same ground too much. I remember when we were around the table, they quite often say, "Oh, what's your thoughts on La Tâche? What's your thoughts on Romanée-Conti?" There's sometimes little discussion points because is the difference between the two vast in a certain vintage? They are the two monopole vineyards, so the entirety of the Domaine own these two wonderful pieces of land. So naturally, they're going to want to sort of know a little bit more about our feedback on that because no one else is doing any other expressions of them. And for me, La Tâche completes it's a perfect adjective and had this mesmerizing texture. It was sublime, and it was more sappy, I think, than the Romanée-Conti. So you had that sort of whole bunch character coming in, that sort of green sappy style, along with that sort of the blue exotic side that you can get as well, which always charms me. The Romanée-Conti, I would have to say for me at this stage, it's one of the prominent sort of feelings I've had with Romanée-Conti where there is more mineral presence, and with that almost like a sort of a stony sort of central core that came through, and it made the nose maybe a little bit more subdued than where it was. But we know this wine, it's unlike anything. Its texture comes into play with a decade or more of bottle age, ideally 15, 20 years, and that's what Romanée-Conti is about. So I would say Romanée-Conti probably is going to be the better one overall. However, I scored La Tâche as my preference, slightly in favour higher on that one.
Yeah, I think I agree with Adam's notes here. and it's like how Guy said it as well. The nose is extraordinary, almost violently vinous. I scribbled very whole bunch, which will please Guy Seddon. And you do get that. There's this sort of weight of fruit, and not overt power, but sort of serene elegance and persistence it was amazing on the tash at the moment. And then, Romanée-Conti. I did actually put in my notes that it wasn't as shy as I expected. Having tasted it before, and you understand sort of how sometimes it is a little bit reticent. I do think that it was a bit more open than I was expecting, and there was the power there. Tannin so long and refined. I think anyone who is lucky enough to try a glass of that in 20, 30 years' time will be pretty happy.
More than happy. It's nice that Mr. Brett Smith have a little barb at Mr. Seddon there in public. I mean, I can assure people this goes on all the time in the office. We're constantly taking the mickey as soon as I say salinity at any point. Mr. Brett Smith's hackles go up.
I think I may have had a go at him in a couple of tasting notes in the past, so maybe it was a retaliation of some sort. The one thing I was going to sort of ask you guys is, what do you feel the sort of relative weight of expectation is when you're approaching La Tâche and Romanée-Conti? Do you feel that you approach Romanée-Conti with almost more reverence and, you hold it up to a higher standard, or similar?
I think you would incline to be a little bit more nervous about tasting Romanée-Conti only because it's such a rarity.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying La Tâche is an everyday occurrence, because of course it's not, and it's a complete treat, once or twice in the year to have a bottle with someone. But yeah, I think it's that, and I think La Tâche is that little bit more obvious, a little bit easier to get your head around. So I guess it's that you'd want to spend longer with Romanée-Conti, I think, and see it develop in the glass. I'd be a little bit more nervous, that's all.
Yeah, I think reverence certainly plays a part for me, and purely because, again, through the generosity of our customers, I've been fortunate enough to try quite a few Romanée-Contis with various bottle age, and it honestly, hand on heart, is different to any other Burgundy Grand Cru. It is the greatest, and this isn't bias, this is just, you speak to other wine lovers who've had that sort of fortune to taste Romanée-Conti. There is nothing quite like it, particularly in maturity, where you've got this combination of, we've talked about the weight, we've talked about texture, we've talked about its ethereal, it's effortless, it's silken, and so therefore, yes, I do approach it with this sort of.
But it does have the weight of expectation.
Yeah, no, it does. You're right.
I think this is, as I often say, it's a bit of a cliche, but expectation can be the biggest wine killer in terms that you go in expecting 5 stars, and if it's 4 3/4, which is still an amazing wine, you're sort of left disappointed in some way.
Well, it's a bit like art, or a bit like music. You look at a Picasso with the knowledge that it is a Picasso, and so you have that kind of weight of expectation. Yeah. And it's such a unique style that it couldn't be anything else, and therefore you sort of ascribe a greatness to it. But I think the ability to stand back and just sort of try these wines for what they are, which is a glass of wine, is important. And
very.
Yeah.
And obviously, and obviously we're sort of talking around game on this one, but provenance of a bottle is just it's just everything. The bottle has to have been looked after the whole time.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm nervous all the time, Guido, so
that's a different issue.
We're trying to work on that.
Sorry for another podcast.
Yes, possibly one not to publish.
Well, let's move on to the whites then. Yeah. And I mean, I'll sort of get in here. This is one of my favourite. This is my favourite wine of DRC.
This is where you needed the hanky, because you were a little bit teary here.
That was.
So in fact, Perrine now refers to you as Mr. Montrachet, which I'm nauseated by, but I suppose you probably deserve it. Anyway, go on. Carry on, Joseph.
Well, at Courton Charlemagne, the first vintage for the Domaine in 2019. As you know, they've taken a long-term lease from some of Bonneau de Martre's vineyards. And I think it's really coming into its own quite pleasingly now. I don't think it's amiss to say when they started with Courton, they had to sort of find their feet, because maybe the earlier vintage had more of a DRC feel rather than finding the balance of terroir combined with that. And I think certainly in 22 Courton Charlemagne, this is a vintage. 22 is one of those rare vintages where the level of greatness for white and red is quite equal, in my opinion, and those don't come along very often. 20 and 10 stand out as the most recent ones other than that. Mm-hmm. And you had this, it charges with that sort of limestone calcaire, as the French would say, lead from the glass, and that sort of stays present within the palate. bringing this ripe fruit from 22, this sort of buttery pastry, and allows phenolics to build, and then this point of tension, and it's really quite Courton Charlemagne-esque. The Montrachet, that's the one that I got, very emotional. It's my favourite from the range in 2022 for me. I scored it 19.5 plus. In fact,
off the fence.
I'm going to quickly read my tasting note. It's rather embarrassing. I just wrote, I adore this nose. There is a sense of overwhelming power, which is handled most beautifully in the most loving and elegant of hands. Purity of fruit screams through with a ripeness that you cannot take your attention away from, underpinned by glorious mineral expression. It is emotional. I feel close to tears. The palate has the exact same feel, rich but weightless, volume but not mass. This has hit me in the heart. Stunning.
Oh, beautiful.
It is, but I mean, that is the first and last time we'll let you read one of your tasting notes in full. I don't think,
it's a bit lengthy.
I don't think it's in anyone's interest to hear that. No, I mean, God, what a one. And I will briefly, after take you through a tasting that Adam and I did when we were there 3 weeks ago, which was completely white wine focused, which I think was Perrine's idea. But yeah, I mean, I think these were wonderfully different this year, which is great. I mean, they are profoundly different crus. I think often in many ways, Courton Charlemagne is one of the most precise, laser-like, lifted wine of light. That's not my phrase that's been used a lot. Whereas Montrachet, in many ways, is supposed to be a little bit gourmand, a little bit bordering on Mr. Brett Smith's favourite word of vulgar. It's supposed to have a lot of richness and weight to it. Montrachet is a white wine that desperately wants to be a red wine.
Especially with their late picking.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was going to say. I think the style of Romanée-Conti is that they do pick their whites later than others. And so I think if you compare the Bonnet de Martre style with the Romanée-Conti style, for example, there's a difference in picking dates. And I think that comes through in the style of the wine, which is powerful and big and, loses none of that minerality beneath it. It's quite the reverse. But I think it's a very brave, almost extrovert style of white winemaking.
Yeah, I think we poured the Courton Charlemagne 2020 last year, and it definitely felt more DRC in style, like closer to the Montrachet. Whereas this year, the 22, I'm going to actually quote Thibaut Jacquet from Bonnet de Martre, because that was how I felt it was, and it's a very Partridge quote, but liquid electricity is what he is how he described it.
Well, I think that's slightly what I'm talking about, the sort of verve and energy.
Yeah, it was completely sort of, actually Bryce hates me saying this now and discusses it quite a lot, but it was a lemon rocket, and I enjoyed it.
It has become something of a cliche of yours. Yeah, I know it's your favourite. But I mean, I think what's really interesting about Courton Charlemagne, and actually when we were there, we had a trek up there, and you forget quite how steep, particularly just after lunch, quite how steep Courton Charlemagne can be. But with the lease that they've taken from Bonnet de Martre, what I think is really clever on both parts is that Bonnet de Martre essentially has three large sections. And the lease is for a little bit. It's actually for 4 parcels for Romanée-Conti, but it's 1 parcel from the top, 1 from the bottom, and 2 from the middle. So given that both produce 1 Courton Charlemagne wine, as you would, it is like for like in a sense, which I think is quite exciting. And also, I mean, they've grubbed up about 0.8 of a hectare from the Romanée-Conti plot, which is quite a commitment when you've got a lease, and obviously that's rather a large amount of production. So it shows their commitment to it and how much they love it. And just to go on to the tasting, as I mentioned, there's always a tasting on the second day of the sort of agents meetup that we do every other year, and we did 19, 20 and 21, Courton Charlemagne and Montrachet, Courton Charlemagne and Montrachet alongside each other, all blind, which obviously is both wonderful but quite intimidating. And there were some amazing tasters, far more experienced and eloquent than me, but it was fascinating to see. And you can see the differences between the wines, but the vintages also. And I think generally 20 probably from those 3 vintages just about won out when people were asked to name their favourite pair. But 19, I think Adam and I both went for 19 actually. But they're glorious wines. And then we had some Montrachets, which 99, 09, 99 and 89. And one thing you can see is that when you take Montrachet, I think pre-14 is kind of a little bit of a line for me. Pre-14, there is this element to which the late picking means there's a tiny bit of botrytis to the wines, and you get that real rich, luxurious character. And I think purely, it's not a stylistic change from the Domaine per se. It's just that, vintages 14 onwards have been moist, they've been warm, they've been drier. So you just don't get this, or less of, or don't get this botrytis character. So there is a little bit of a change there. Having said that, I remember asking Aubert if there was anything he would change about Montrachet 14, because I thought, a little bit like you're saying about this one, I thought Montrachet 14 was pretty perfect.
Yeah, because there's also, you mentioned about Alexandre Bernier, and obviously who's the current winemaker, and he was at the Domaine for a while, but then took over from Bernard Noblet. I think 18's his first full vintage.
He did about 10 vintages with him before it being his head on the block, so to speak.
It's natural to maybe sort of try and draw whether these are sort of invented by us or by the lover of these wines. Have there been any changes in there? Because, 17 starts to become a little bit more of that, shows that focus within DRC's Montrachet a little bit more presently. And I think that continues in its style, especially with that sort of raciness as well, but with texture. So I don't know, we shall see.
And there is one other change they made, which I can't remember if Adam actually mentions it in the offer or not, but Sylvain Pellegrini has taken on as the chef de culture in the vineyards, and he joined in March 23, and he will be looking after the entirety of the vineyards, whereas previously they had a bit of a white wine team and a red wine team, if you like, in terms of the vineyards only. So that'll be interesting to.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth saying, that's all very interesting detail, but the overriding kind of desire of the Domaine is that it's all about the terroir, it's all about the vines. It's not the personalities. And,
completely.
It's probably good for us to acknowledge that.
Yeah, you're completely right, and it's not. It's about the sum of the parts. Yeah. I mean, no one is bigger than the Domaine, and there's no, So I think which makes it wonderful. One thing I suddenly realised we did brush over, because we don't allocate it at this stage, but it was tasted in both the masterclass and probably in your tasting, is the Romanée du Blanchet, which I thought, which came back into being released in 99, and is for on-trade only in all markets actually. And I just thought it was a joy. It does offer that earlier drinking scenario, but doesn't lack any seriousness. That's for sure.
Yeah, indeed. It had that sort of quintessential Vosne typicity about it. It's had a seriousness as well, and within its structure this year, which I thought was quite commendable, because people maybe, and incorrectly, just assume because it's this sort of the younger vines and some of the plots of the Premier Crus that the Domaine has blended all together, that it might offer a little bit just a sort of a more charming and fruit-forward style of what the Domaine can offer. But in 22, I think there's far more at play.
Yeah, it was almost like a miniature La Tâche in a way. I mean, that sort of downplays it, but there were so much going on there.
Yeah. I mean, on this note, before we wrap up the 22s, Duvel Blanchet, the reason I'm linking it is Richebourg is obviously going to be going under some replanting soon. And it's going to diminish quite significantly.
But already, I think in 24 they grubbed up 40 of the 85 Uve.
Yeah.
So that's not Uve. That would be nice. So it's pretty much, let's say it's pretty much half.
Yeah.
Going to be pretty much half the volume.
So obviously for all you Domaine Romanée-Conti fans and drinks like that, it will mean you're going to see a real drop in production levels of Richebourg. There's going to be a replanting process, but once those vines are replanted and a few years takes place, they are more than likely going to be destined for Duvel Blanchet. So there's going to be quite an interesting following potentially for when those significant chunk of Richebourg vines go back into the young fruit of Duvel Blanchet, but less of the sort of the anorak side of it. If I was to, let's finish on this question for the 22s. You find a genie's lamp, you rub it, you get your 3 wishes. Which 3 wines are you taking from 22?
Ooh. Okay, I thought you were going to ask overall.
Well, I'll start. So my 3, this is all, let's caveat this is personal taste, but this is the beauty of wine. Obviously Montrachet, and then if I'm being honest, it would probably be La Tâche, and then it might be Echezot or Richebourg, but I'll leave it at that.
So does that mean we have to choose different wines?
No, absolutely not.
Well, on the basis of what I sort of scored, I would go, which is different from you, Corton Charlemagne, Romanée-Conti, and then I really struggle to overlook my sort of loyalty for Grand Echezot, so I'm going to go with those 3.
I would take Echezot and La Tâche, and then I just love Romanée Saint-Vivant, so I think I would
good. I'm glad I was feeling quite guilty about that. Good.
Echezot, Richebourg, La Tâche.
There we go.
Okay.
Good. Very nice.
That's a nice problem.
So I think before we fully wind down, should we just chat about some vintages that we've all had the fortune and pleasure to enjoy with customers at dining tables over the last sort of year and see what's drinking well now?
I mean, I might just sort of start that by saying that, that this is one of the things that's absolutely our one of our main tasks, and something that came up a lot in the agents meetup, was that these wines need drinking, and people need to be opening these bottles and not be intimidated about drinking them. And I'm slightly nervous here, but I mean, Aubert came out and he was in very good form, and it was wonderful to see him. But he came out with a phrase which was to say that this sort of obsession with collecting is almost a disease. And by that, what he means is, people need to be trying these wines. And I think, to go on about vintages, the 17s are gorgeous. If you're going to have a real sort of younger vintage, and I think that's not just the Domaine, I think a lot of Red Burgundy is. 11s are drinking really well.
Yeah.
And two other vintages that I think, whilst you maybe wait for what people see as the 5-star vintages, I've been really lucky to have Grand Echezot 7 and 8 on 2 separate occasions recently. And those 2 vintages, in different ways, I mean, if you've got those, what are you waiting for in a way? They will age and they'll become older, but their personalities in 7 and 8 are just showing so wonderfully now. Yeah, I would get cracking on those. I mean, I just think they're delicious.
With 22, I do think there's going to be a lovely period of where it's going to show flamboyance. It's going to show that sweet Pinot charm. However, I suspect they'll close down like the other great vintages that have, and so then you'll need to leave them for a long slumber. In the meantime, going backwards, I agree. 17s, there's a real sort of concentration of fruit there which is prevailing and giving a real sort of decadence to the wines, which is lovely now, and I think that'll sort of stay open for a little while. 11s, I mean, I've had most of the 11s now, and they are in a gorgeous place. A lot of people overlook them, and I understand why, because there was a phase where it was quite focused on the green character, the traits from the vintage in terms of rainfall, cooler periods. It felt that the sappy notes were a bit too prominent, and the fruit wasn't coming out, but there is texture that's come on now, and there's a sweetness of fruit. Now, these aren't going to be a wine that's going to be the apogee of DRC, but they are glorious now, and I would encourage anyone to try their 11s. 13s, I think, are quite interesting. They're very aromatic, and they offer a lot of pleasure. 12s, I would leave for further cellaring. 14s feel like they've closed down again. They went through a very joyous period of.
I've had 1 or 2, and they've been very good, but I don't disagree with that.
Yeah, I think they're starting to close, and so. Anything in between that, between 14 and 22, between 14 and 17, I would leave, and 17 afterwards. Going below 10 and 9, which I think need more time. 8s, I think, should really get a special mention. I mean, Romanée-Saint-Vivant 2008 is quintessential Romanée-Saint-Vivant for me. It's quite miraculous in its delivery. 7s and 4s.
Yeah. 4s way outperform.
Yeah.
The perception. Yeah.
6s now.
They're a little bit more surly. I find them a little bit more surly.
I still think they need time. They're a bit like an 11, but to a sort of the next degree, where I think that fruit has sort of been kept shrouded for longer, and it still needs more bottle age to find its perfect drinking window. Yeah.
Well, a recent example, just coming back to your question, La Tâche 92, which having opened it and been slightly, not underwhelmed. Well, I've said it now, so slightly underwhelmed when it was first opened. I then thought it put on volume and weight and personality in an extraordinary way over the next, 3-4 hours. And it really seemed to grow in stature in the glass. And that, in terms of evolution from opening to enjoyment in the glass, I thought was one of the supreme examples I've seen of that.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah. I'll give a final shout to 2000 as well. I think 2000 DRCs are pretty exceptional now as well. Yeah.
Cool. The 08 Romanée-Saint-Vivant was the first actual DRC I tried. And it was,
Is that the same you were with Joe?
Yeah. And it was
dreadful.
And it was stunning, apart from the company. But yeah, it was. It was really. But I mean, since then,
very nervous company.
RSV 11, showing really well at the moment, and I was fortunate enough to try that 92 La Tâche with you, Guido, which was special. First DRC birth year. Who can ever say that?
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
That makes me feel even older.
You're the only one in the room who can say that.
I mean, I think the only thing I would say in closing maybe is that when it comes to opening these, I think it's very interesting what you were just saying, guys. The Domaine are very sort of anti-decanting and likewise, but I think the best way to enjoy the wines is to give yourself plenty of time, 3-4 hours, whatever, open the wine, obviously check it, have a large mouthful, and then just let the wine stand and serve it that little bit cool. And the wines just do so much in the glass. I think they're just beautiful, and that's the real joy of them, and find one, maybe two people to share it with. But I think you wanna have a good, couple of glasses. It's just a joy.
Possibly keep it selfish. No one's going to judge.
One other person who's not drinking is maybe perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Hello. Wonderful. Well, thank you, chaps. I think that sort of maybe went on a little bit longer, but hopefully anyone who's got an interest in Domaine La Romanée-Conti has found it informative and easy listening. But we will sign off on our first DRC focused podcast and look forward to another in time. And we'll be back soon, whereas 2023 continues to sort of evolve as a campaign and more releases come out. So it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Yeah, I'm saving the best till last. Goodbye from me.